Have you ever wondered what can happen when a life is just a few steps away from destruction and no one around notices, but heaven sees everything? Perhaps you are watching this video right now because, on some level, this question resonates with you. Because there comes a point in life when wrong choices accumulate, the heart grows weary, the mind becomes confused, and it feels like there's no turning back. It's like being in freefall, watching the ground approach, with no strength to change direction. Some people reach this point silently. On the outside, everything seems normal. Inside, chaos reigns. Impulsive decisions, spiritual detachment, broken relationships, disguised addictions, attitudes that once seemed small but now exact a high price. The signs are there, clear, almost screaming, announcing imminent destruction. Even so, many continue, believing they still have control, when in reality they are already at their limit. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever felt you were going too far but couldn't stop? It is precisely in this scenario that the strongest testimonies of prophetic deliverances before destruction emerge. Real stories of people who were about to lose everything, their faith, their family, their very lives, and who were interrupted by something that was not in human plans. An unexpected warning, a message that arrived at the right moment. A simple word, but full of spiritual authority. Nothing spectacular in the eyes of the world, but absolutely decisive in the spiritual realm. Perhaps you're thinking this sounds like a coincidence, but those who have lived through it know it wasn't. There's a profound difference between chance and purpose. When a prophetic message arrives precisely at the moment when destruction seemed inevitable, it not only warns, it confronts, awakens, and redefines destinies. And the most impressive thing is that, often, this message arrives when the person had already given up listening, when their heart was hardened, when their mind said there was no way out. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you more than you imagine. This isn't just another exciting story. It's a spiritual portrait of how God acts before the final fall, of how heaven moves when the earth no longer offers hope, of how a simple warning can interrupt a path of destruction that seemed irreversible. As you listen, you might begin to see parallels with your own life. Situations, decisions, warnings you ignored, or messages that seemed too small to take seriously. Could it be that, at some point, you also received a sign and didn't realize its gravity? Or perhaps you are receiving it now through this video. Think about it. Often, deliverance doesn't come after the mistake, but before it. It doesn't come with applause, but with confrontation. It doesn't come to please, but to save. There's something powerful about a message arriving at the exact minute, that final second before the ultimate fall. It's as if time stops for an instant, just to give one last chance for change. And it's about this kind of moment that we're going to talk about here. A moment that seemed ordinary, but that carried a decision capable of changing everything. A warning that interrupted a trajectory of destruction and completely transformed the destiny of a life in decline. And as the story begins to unfold, you might realize that it's not just about someone, but also about you, about choices, about hearing the right voice at the right time, and about what happens when a message from heaven finds a heart on the edge. As this story unfolds in your mind, I want to invite you to not just observe it from the outside, because messages like this don't appear by chance, and when they reach us, they almost always awaken memories, feelings, or experiences that were kept silent. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Perhaps a phrase, a memory, a moment when you felt something warned you before a bigger fall. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if, in some way, this message has already begun to stir your heart, consider liking this video. This simple gesture helps much more than it seems, because it allows this content to reach people who are living through that decisive moment, that turning point that no one sees, but that can change everything. When you like it, you're not just supporting the channel, you're helping this prophetic message reach those who need a warning before destruction. If you feel that this type of content strengthens you, awakens you, or makes you reflect more deeply, subscribing to the channel is a way to walk together. Here we build a community of people who believe that God still speaks, still warns, and still delivers. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of message, people who may be at their breaking point and not even know it yet. This space only exists because there are people on the other side who listen, feel, comment, and share. When you get involved, you transform this channel into more than just videos. You transform it into a place of connection, testimonies, and real hope. And while you reflect on all of this, on warnings, choices, and that 1 minute that changes destinies, the story we are about to delve into will show you how a single, seemingly simple message was able to stop a fall that seemed irreversible. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it's precisely here that the story takes on real weight, the kind that tightens your chest and makes you stop for a second to reflect. When everything pointed to the worst, it wasn't something sudden. It wasn't an isolated accident. It was a silent sequence of poorly thought-out decisions, choices made in exhaustion, in pain, in the illusion that it was still possible to control the consequences. Little by little, that life drifted away from what once brought meaning, purpose, and direction. What was once conviction became doubt. What was once faith became empty habit. And what was once care became negligence. There comes a point in everyone's journey when the signs become too clear to ignore. Emotions become unstable, the mind confused, the mindset sees no way out, only survival. Nights grow longer, thoughts heavier, and the heart carries a weight unseen. On the outside, everything continues moving forward. Inside, something has already begun to crumble. And it is precisely at this point that many believe they have reached the end of the line, that there is no turning back, that their destiny is already sealed. The consequences of the wrong path don't take long to appear. Strained relationships, missed opportunities, a constant feeling of living a life that no longer matches who you truly are. There's a hidden truth in this process. No one falls all at once. The fall happens in stages, behind the scenes, while the person tries to convince themselves that everything is all right. But it's not. And the body feels it, the mind screams, the soul falls silent. Spiritual estrangement doesn't just happen when someone stops believing, but when they stop listening. Listening to their own conscience, listening to the warnings, listening to that inner voice that insists something needs to change. But the longer these signs are ignored, the harder it becomes to turn back. The journey becomes heavy, colorless, meaningless, and the feeling of being trapped in a cycle becomes almost unbearable. It's at this stage that many no longer ask for help, because they believe no one would understand or that they've already gone too far. Humanly speaking, everything indicated that the story was sealed. There were no plans, no expectations, no concrete hope. Just the attempt to go on for another day, pushing life forward with the strength that remained. Transformation seemed distant, almost unattainable. The decisions made in the past now exacted too high a price, and the idea of starting over seemed more painful than continuing to fall. The emotional impact of this moment is profound. Guilt, fear, regret, and a strange feeling of emptiness begin to walk hand in hand. It's as if the person is watching their own life from the outside, unable to interfere. And perhaps this is the most dangerous point of all. When pain becomes normal, when chaos becomes routine, when the fall no longer frightens, that's when many are truly lost, because they stop believing that anything can still change. But there's something almost no one notices while they're in that place. Even when everything seems lost, even when wrong decisions pile up and the journey seems irreversible, there's still movement happening behind the scenes. There's still a purpose that hasn't been canceled. There's still a silent care that hasn't given up. But this usually doesn't come in the way we expect. It doesn't come with clear answers, nor with immediate solutions. It often comes as a final warning, a simple, almost unnoticed notice, but carrying a weight capable of changing everything. It is in this scenario of maximum tension, when the fall seems inevitable, that something begins to align invisibly. Time, circumstances, people, everything approaches a decisive point. One of those moments when a single word can redefine an entire trajectory. An instant when the journey can take two completely different paths, depending on a choice, a listening, a reaction. Perhaps, as you listen to all this, you're recognizing parts of your own story. Maybe not with the same intensity, but with similar feelings. The sensation of being on the edge, of carrying mistakes that seem too big, of living with consequences that weary the soul. And it is precisely there that this story begins to gain even greater depth, because what seemed like just a fall was actually about to become the setting for something totally unexpected. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely here that something invisible begins to become perceptible, almost palpable. When all seemed lost, when that life was already convinced that there was no way out, it was at that exact point that the message arrived. Not before, not after. At the right moment. And this is important to understand, because it wasn't a grand scene, nor something cinematic in the eyes of the human. It was simple. It was direct. It was unexpected. Precisely for that reason, so powerful. Sometimes we imagine that a divine warning comes with noise, with extraordinary signs, with something impossible to ignore. But most of the time it comes discreetly, almost ornately. A phrase spoken by an unlikely person. A verse that jumps out without logical explanation. A phone call that happens at an inopportune time. A message that could have been ignored, but that carries a different weight, as if it pierced all defenses and went straight to the heart. It is at this moment that something changes inside, even before any external decision. In that story, the message arrived when the mind was too weary to resist and the heart too vulnerable to pretend not to hear. It was a clear yet simple warning. It didn't come full of details, nor with immediate promises. It came as a loving confrontation, one that exposes the hidden truth the person had been avoiding facing. A truth that doesn't accuse, but reveals. That doesn't condemn, but awakens. That doesn't push, but calls. And the impact was immediate, not because everything was resolved in that instant, but because something was interrupted. The fall was paused. The cycle was broken. It's as if, for a second, time slowed down just to allow for a different choice. That is the power of a word charged with spiritual authority. It doesn't need to be long or elaborate. It needs to be precise. And it was. Many people call it coincidence. But those who have experienced something like this know it's not. Coincidences don't affect the soul in that way. Coincidences don't provoke that silent shiver, that feeling of, this is not normal. There is an intelligence behind the exact moment. There is care behind the scenes. There is an action that escapes human logic, but that makes perfect sense when viewed with spiritual eyes. The message wasn't meant to scare, but to interrupt. It wasn't meant to punish, but to protect. It exposed wrong decisions, yes, but it also revealed that there was still time. Time to change the mindset. Time to review choices. Time to redirect the journey before the impact became irreversible. And that changes everything. Because until then, that person believed they had already gone too far. The message proved otherwise. There is something profoundly transformative when someone realizes they are still seen, even in the worst moments. That they are still reached even after so many mistakes. That they are still warned, even when they no longer expect anything. This realization generates an internal shock, a mixture of fear and relief, of shame and hope. It is uncomfortable but at the same time liberating. Because it shows that the story is not yet over. And perhaps the most impressive thing is this. The message didn't force anyone to change. It simply revealed the path and left the decision in the hands of those who listened. That's where the most delicate part of the journey comes in. Because listening is one thing, obeying is another. But at that specific moment, something had already been activated inside. An awakened consciousness. An alert impossible to ignore. A clear feeling that that word could not be treated as something commonplace. Often, deliverance begins exactly like this. Not with an immediate external change, but with a silent internal change. The way of thinking begins to adjust. Resistance begins to fall. The idea of transformation, which previously seemed distant, begins to be considered. And this happens because the message didn't just come to inform, it came to touch a specific point in the soul. Came at the right moment because, if it had come earlier, it might have been ignored. If it had come later, it might have been too late. As this story unfolds, it's impossible not to think about how many times something similar has happened around us, or even to us. How many messages were discarded for seeming too simple? How many warnings were ignored out of pride, haste, or fear? How many revelations went unnoticed because they didn't fit what we expected to hear? And yet, even with all that, there are moments when the message finds the heart exactly when it is ready to listen. This is the point where everything starts to change direction, even if externally everything still seems the same. Something has been planted, something has been awakened, something has been interrupted, and, from here on, decisions are no longer made automatically. The journey enters a decisive phase, where each choice carries greater weight, because now there is awareness. There is alertness. There is purpose at stake. Write this down. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely at this point that the story ceases to be merely a warning and transforms into a real crossroads. After the message was heard, nothing was ever the same again, even if, on the outside, everything still seemed the same. The impact of the word was not immediate on the environment, but it was profound internally. And that is where the real conflict begins. Hearing something that makes sense, that confronts, that reveals a hidden truth, and having to decide what to do with it. Obedience is never automatic. Before it, fear almost always comes. Fear of change, fear of losing what little remains, fear of admitting that the path was wrong. The mind goes to war with itself. One part wants to remain in the familiar, even if it is destructive. The other part feels that this message cannot be ignored. It is a silent clash between the old mentality and the possibility of transformation. And this clash hurts, because it forces the person to confront who they have become and who they could be again. There was doubt. There was resistance. There was that almost unconscious attempt to rationalize everything, to diminish the weight of the message, to treat it as just another opinion. But something wouldn't let me move forward the same way. The word I'd heard kept coming back to me at the most unexpected moments. In the silence of the night, in the midst of an impulsive decision, in that instant before repeating an old mistake. It was as if the message had created an internal pause, a space between impulse and action. And that space changes everything. The choice to obey was not accompanied by absolute certainty. It came with trembling, insecurity, a step taken almost in the dark. Obeying, in that context, did not mean understanding everything, but trusting enough not to continue doing what was leading to destruction. It was a simple decision on the outside, but gigantic on the inside. A decision that interrupted a cycle that seemed automatic, repetitive, inevitable. When obedience happens, something invisible begins to reorganize itself behind the scenes. It's not magic. It's alignment. The journey begins to change course because the person stops insisting on the wrong path. Small attitudes begin to be reevaluated. Certain companions cease to make sense. Certain choices begin to bother. The mindset begins to adjust slowly, almost imperceptibly. Not because everything has become easy, but because now there is awareness and direction. What's most striking is that deliverance didn't come as an immediate, grand event. It came as protection, as an interruption of the worst, as doors that didn't open, paths that didn't advance, impulsive decisions that were avoided. Sometimes deliverance is exactly that which doesn't happen, that which doesn't materialize, that which seemed inevitable, but was silently blocked because someone chose to listen and obey. Obedience creates a safe space where before there was only risk. It doesn't erase the past, but it redefines the future. It doesn't eliminate all consequences, but it prevents them from becoming fatal. And that is already a powerful change of course. The person begins to realize that the message didn't come to limit, but to preserve. It didn't come to take away freedom, but to prevent an irreversible loss. There is a profound emotional impact in this process. A mixture of relief and responsibility. Relief at realizing there was still a way out. Responsibility at understanding that, from that point on, it was no longer possible to pretend ignorance. Obedience brings clarity, and clarity demands more conscious decisions. The journey ceases to be guided solely by impulse and becomes guided by purpose, even if that purpose is not yet entirely clear. True transformation almost never begins with major external changes. It begins with small, internal choices repeated daily. A no said at the right time, a boundary set, a step back before repeating an old mistake. These small acts of obedience build an invisible shield around the person. And, over time, what once seemed like a sacrifice begins to make sense as self-care. There is an important revelation here. Obedience is not about losing who you are, it's about preventing the loss of who you were created to be. The message that halted the destruction didn't demand perfection, only willingness. Willingness to listen, to adjust, to stop fighting against what was trying to save. And when that willingness appeared, even fragile, even full of doubts, something began to move differently. Spiritual listening has this power. It doesn't force, but invites. It doesn't shout, but insists. It doesn't control, but guides. And when someone decides to obey, even without understanding the whole plan, that decision resonates far beyond the present moment. It alters the trajectory, changes the impact of future choices, and creates a new starting point within the same story. Perhaps, from the outside, no one noticed the shift. But, deep down, that person knew. Something was interrupted. Something was preserved. Something was redirected. The fall that seemed certain lost its force. The imminent destruction gave way to a more conscious, more careful, more aligned journey. Not perfect, but alive. Not without challenges, but meaningful. And it is precisely from this point that the story begins to reveal even deeper layers. Because only after obedience does one understand the magnitude of the deliverance. Only then do you realize what could have happened. Only then does the person clearly see how that message arrived at the exact moment, before the final impact. Write this down. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it's only with time that some things truly begin to make sense. At the moment the message was heard and the decision to obey was made, no one had a full idea of what had been avoided. Deliverance often doesn't present itself as something visible or immediate. It reveals itself later, when the person looks back and realizes that certain paths were not taken, certain doors did not open, and certain choices, which seemed small, would have led to irreversible consequences. As the days and weeks passed, that life began to see more clearly what was happening behind the scenes. Situations that had previously seemed normal began to be viewed from a different perspective. Conversations that could have led to destructive decisions did not occur. Environments that had previously attracted people now caused discomfort. People who seemed indispensable naturally distanced themselves. All of this, which at first seemed like mere coincidence, began to form a clear pattern of protection. It is at this point that the hidden truth is revealed. If that message had been ignored, the impact would have been profound. Not only emotional, but spiritual, relational, and even physical. The path that was being followed would not have ended merely in frustration, but in losses that would be difficult to repair. The fall would not have been symbolic, it would have been concrete. And realizing this afterward generates a mixture of chills and gratitude, because it becomes clear that something greater intervened before the worst happened. Spiritual clarity comes precisely from this belated understanding of events. God doesn't usually warn after the collapse, but before it. He doesn't wait for destruction to occur before acting. He warns when there is still a choice, when there is still the possibility of changing course. This is a biblical principle that is repeated throughout the scriptures. The warning always precedes judgment, correction comes before the final fall, the call happens before the definitive loss. How many times do we see this in biblical accounts? People warned before disaster, alerted before exile, called before ruin. Not all listened, not all obeyed, but those who listened and decided to adjust their course experienced deliverance. Not because they were better, but because they were willing to listen. This strengthens the authority of this story, because it shows that it is not an isolated event, but a consistent spiritual pattern. When a person begins to apply this to their own life, something changes internally. They start to revisit past moments and realize how many times they were warned, how many times they felt discomfort without understanding why, how many times a simple word tried to interrupt a negative cycle. And, along with this realization comes responsibility. Because understanding that God delivers before destruction completely changes how one approaches future decisions. The mindset shifts from reactive to preventative. People begin to value subtle warnings, internal discomforts, and unexpected pauses more. What was previously ignored is now observed with greater attention. Because now there is an awareness that not every escape is noisy. Some are silent, discreet, almost invisible. But that doesn't make them any less significant. On the contrary, it is precisely these that prevent deep scars. There is also a strong emotional impact in this belated recognition. A feeling of humility arises because it becomes clear that, alone, no one could have escaped that path. At the same time, a genuine gratitude is born, based not only on what was achieved, but mainly on what was avoided. What didn't happen becomes as important as what did. And this transforms the way one sees their own history. The journey is reinterpreted. What once seemed like a setback is now seen as protection. What seemed like a loss is now understood as deliverance. What seemed like silence now reveals care. This reinterpretation of one's own life strengthens faith because it shows that even in the most confusing moments, there was guidance being offered. Perhaps not in the desired way, but in the necessary way. This understanding fosters spiritual maturity. A person comes to understand that God doesn't always deliver by removing them from the problem afterward, but by preventing them from entering it in the first place. He doesn't always act by erasing the consequences, but by preventing them from becoming permanent. And this changes everything, because it redefines the concept of care, love, and divine intervention. By applying this reflection to their own reality, many begin to realize that they are exactly at this point right now, receiving warnings, feeling discomfort, being confronted in a loving way. And the question ceases to be, why is this happening to me? And becomes, what is this trying to spare me from? This shift in perspective is powerful because it moves the focus from fear to discernment. The story that began with a life in decline now reveals itself as a testament to preservation. Not because everything turned out perfect, but because the worst was avoided. Not because there was no pain, but because there were limits. Not because there were no consequences, but because there was mercy before the collapse. And it is at this point that the message gains even more strength, because it ceases to be just about one person and becomes about everyone who is willing to listen before it's too late. And as this understanding deepens, new layers of this story begin to emerge, showing that deliverance was not the end of the process, but the beginning of something even more transformative, something that could only happen because the final fall was interrupted at the right time. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because history only fulfills its purpose when it transcends time and reaches the present. Everything said so far ceases to be merely a distant testimony when we allow ourselves to honestly ask if this isn't happening right now, before our very eyes. Sometimes the signs don't come with fanfare. They emerge as subtle anxieties, unexpected changes of course, improbable encounters, words that repeat themselves in different ways. And the question that remains is not whether God still speaks, but whether we are attentive enough to hear. There is a truth that runs through this entire journey. God continues to warn beforehand. He continues to protect beforehand. He continues to deliver before the final fall. This hasn't changed. What changes is our mindset when interpreting events. Many confuse warning with delay, care with limitation, protection with loss. But when we look more deeply, we realize there is a pattern of love behind these seemingly confusing movements. Nothing is random when the goal is to preserve life, purpose, and essence. Perhaps you're experiencing a moment where certain doors won't open, certain decisions seem stuck, certain paths suddenly lose their luster. And this might be frustrating you. But what if, instead of frustration, this is intervention? What if, instead of blockage, this is liberation? Transformation begins when we change the lens through which we view events. The impact of this change is profound because it redefines how we deal with choices, expectations, and even silence. Many people only understand later, after time passes, after the danger becomes clear, after the consequences appear in the lives of others. And then that silent thought arises, if I had gone that way, perhaps I wouldn't be here now. This recognition doesn't generate fear, but discernment. It reveals the inner workings of a care that was present even when it seemed absent. Applying this message to one's own life requires courage. Courage to admit that not every impulse should be followed, that not every opportunity is a gift, that not every sense of urgency comes from God. Sometimes the warning comes precisely to slow down, to interrupt, to create a space between immediate desire and the final decision. And in that space, much can be preserved. God continues to use simple means to communicate profound things. A casual conversation that touches on a sensitive point. A phrase that echoes for days. A verse that keeps popping up. A restlessness that won't go away. None of this needs to be spectacular to be real. Spiritual authority lies not in volume, but in precision. When the message is for you, it finds a way to break through your defenses and reach the right place. And perhaps most importantly, understand that listening doesn't mean being immune to difficulties. It means being protected from the worst. The journey continues, decisions continue to demand effort, transformation happens in stages. But there's a huge difference between walking without direction and walking with discernment. between falling by ignoring warnings and adjusting course upon recognizing them. This story doesn't end with deliverance. It delves deeper into how the person lives afterward, into more conscious choices, into greater sensitivity to signs, into the maturity that emerges when one understands that life isn't just about arriving quickly, but about arriving whole. And this awareness changes everything. It changes relationships, it changes priorities, it changes how one deals with the future. If you feel that something is trying to get your attention right now, perhaps it's not a coincidence. Perhaps it's just another one of those moments when a message arrives at the right minute, not to scare, but to preserve, not to control, but to guide, not to limit, but to save from an impact that hasn't yet happened. The story that began with a life in decline transforms here into a silent invitation to personal reflection. Not to generate anxiety, but to awaken discernment. Because when we learn to listen beforehand, much pain ceases to be necessary later. And it is at this point that each person begins to write their own continuation, based on the choices they make now, with the awareness they have today. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." If you've made it this far, it's because this message has resonated with you. And that, in itself, says a lot. Content like this isn't meant to be passed quickly, but to accompany moments, provoke reflection, and help you see decisions more clearly. If you feel this type of conversation strengthens you, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this journey and receive other messages that may arrive at exactly the right moment. If you want, leave a comment below just so I know you stayed until the end. You can write something like, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end." These words help create a real exchange, showing that it's not just a video talking, but a community listening, feeling, and reflecting together. And if, at any point, you felt a connection to this story, a like is just a way to signal that. It strengthens the reach of the content and helps this type of message reach those who might need to hear something like this right now. There's a video over here that complements this topic very well. If you'd like to continue in this same atmosphere of reflection and discernment, click on it and follow along with me there. The conversation continues.